Joanne Weir didn't expect anything unusual that morning. She had made this trip so many times between Dallas and Washington, D.C. that she could have done it blindfolded. Always sitting in seat 2A. She was familiar with the same airport, the same gate, and the same quiet corner in the Admiral's Club, where everyone knew her by name. Her world was predictable and controlled. And that's exactly how she liked it. Stepping into Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, she moved with the usual quiet elegance. Not loud or showy, but the kind of confidence that comes from knowing she belonged. Her heels clicked steadily on the polished floor, a rhythmic sound that echoed in the familiar space. Behind her, her champagne gold carry-on glided silently over the tiles, a seamless match to her tailored navy coat, which had become a part of her armor. The bag wasn't just luggage, it was a symbol of sophistication and preparedness. As she passed through security, the TSA agent offered a polite nod, which she returned without a word. No delays, no fuss. In the lounge, she sipped warm chamomile tea from a fine porcelain cup while flipping through the day's headlines on her tablet. She mentally prepared for the board meeting ahead, checking off tasks in her head as everything around her felt smooth, polished, and intentional. By the time her gate was called, she was already standing, not eager, but prepared. She boarded early as always, and the agent smiled as her boarding pass was scanned. The flight attendant gave her a small nod, one that acknowledged her experience in this space. As she walked into the first-class cabin, the soft lighting and the faint scent of citrus and leather welcomed her, signaling the beginning of yet another routine journey. As she passed through rows 1 and 2, she saw her seat, 2A, waiting for her as it always had. But something was off. Someone was already sitting in 2B. He was a man in his 40s, dressed in a crisp navy suit, his slim black laptop resting on the tray in front of him as his fingers moved efficiently across the keys. He didn't glance up, didn't fidget, didn't pause to acknowledge her. Joanne slowed just slightly, not enough to make it obvious but enough to feel her own hesitation. Her eyes scanned the situation again, seat 2B. Right next to hers. The man remained completely immersed in whatever was on his screen. His indifference felt almost dismissive. Joanne continued forward, adjusting her bag in the overhead compartment not because it needed adjusting, but because she needed a second longer to process what she was feeling. As she sat down, poised and composed, she adjusted her scarf, crossed her legs, and placed her handbag precisely on her lap. Still, there was no acknowledgement from the man beside her. He kept typing, and she, now feeling uneasy, glanced sideways. It wasn't that she expected a conversation, after all. First-class passengers respected the silence, but his complete disregard felt strange. The absence of a smile, a nod, or any form of politeness made her feel invisible, something she wasn't used to in her world of predictability and control. Joanne couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She glanced sideways at the man next to her, still typing away on his laptop, completely oblivious to her presence. It was odd. In her many years of traveling, she had become accustomed to a certain kind of interaction on flights. Especially in first class, passengers, whether strangers or not, would at least acknowledge one another in some way. A nod, a smile, a polite exchange. But this man didn't do any of that. His complete focus on his work seemed almost deliberate, as if he were shutting her out intentionally. Joanne's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. She wasn't used to being ignored. Sure, people sometimes didn't engage in conversation, but at the very least, they would recognize her presence. She turned her attention back to the window, trying to compose herself, but the unease settled deeper in her chest. She wasn't sure why it bothered her so much. After all, she had traveled this route countless times. Always the same routine, always the same predictable outcomes. But this felt different. The man's calm demeanor, his unwavering focus on his laptop, his lack of acknowledgement, it all felt like an affront to her usual order. Joanne shifted in her seat, adjusting her position, crossing and uncrossing her legs, tapping her fingers lightly against the edge of the armrest. She noticed everything, from the businessman across the aisle sipping his drink, To the couple whispering softly in the row ahead. Everything was as it should be. Everyone else was behaving normally. Except for the man beside her. He seemed completely at ease. Unbothered. And it was that very indifference that began to unravel her. As much as she tried to tell herself it wasn't a big deal, she couldn't escape the discomfort settling deep inside. There was something about the man's self-possession that felt dismissive. Like she wasn't even worthy of his attention. In her experience, people always reacted in some way. A smile was returned. A question was answered. But with him, there was nothing. Just complete indifference. Joanne's mind started to work overtime. She turned to look at him again. Her eyes lingering, searching for some sign of recognition. But there was none. He hadn't so much as flinched when she had subtly nudged the armrest earlier. Not a glance. Not an apology. Nothing. She was beginning to feel like she was in someone else's world. A world where she didn't matter. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Joanne had always been a person who commanded attention. Who was noticed and acknowledged wherever she went. But here, in the cramped first-class cabin of a plane, she was invisible. Her irritation grew, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done about it. She wasn't the type to make a scene, but her frustration was bubbling up, and she felt the need to assert her presence, to reclaim her space. Finally, she leaned slightly toward him, trying to keep her voice light and friendly, though the sharp edge of her irritation was evident in the way she spoke. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, her tone more pointed than she had intended. The man didn't look up from his laptop. He simply replied with a curt, "Yes," his fingers never stopping their steady movement across the keyboard. The lack of any further response left Joanne in an uncomfortable silence. She waited for him to offer some explanation or acknowledgement, anything that would break the tension in the air. But there was nothing. Joanne blinked, feeling a knot of frustration form in her chest. She wasn't used to this kind of indifference. It was unsettling in a way that made her skin prickle. Back in her younger days, when she was first starting out in her career, she would have never been ignored like this. A smile, a polite question, people would always respond. But this man was different. He didn't seem to care. Joanne shifted again, adjusting her position once more, trying to shake off the discomfort. She glanced around the cabin, looking for something, anything, that might help her make sense of the situation. But nothing seemed out of place. Everyone else seemed to be going about their business. It was just her and this man, and his disinterest was eating away at her. She tried to focus on the usual quiet routine of the flight. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him. The man beside her was so calm, so composed, so unbothered. It was like he had nothing to prove, nothing to explain. His certainty in his space, his total lack of concern for her presence, was starting to wear her down. Joanne's unease deepened as she looked at him again. His stillness wasn't casual, it was solid, unshakable. He seemed almost untouchable, and that was the hardest part for her to accept, the idea that this man, this stranger, didn't feel the need to engage with her at all. It was as though she didn't exist. She wasn't used to this kind of treatment. No, she was used to being seen, being recognized, being included. But here, in the quiet of the plane, she felt small and insignificant. And the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her, until she couldn't sit still any longer. With a small, controlled sigh, Joanne reached up and pressed the call button. It was a small thing, but it was her way of trying to reclaim control over the situation. To regain some measure of power in a space where she felt invisible. The soft chime rang overhead. And within moments, Rachel, the flight attendant, was there. Joanne leaned slightly toward her, her voice low and polite, but still tinged with the frustration that had been building inside her. "I think there may have been a mistake," she said, forcing a smile. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I just don't recall anyone ever sitting in that seat." Rachel glanced at the man, then back at Joanne, her expression calm, but with just the slightest shift in her eyebrows. After checking her tablet, Rachel confirmed that there was no mistake, that the seating arrangement was correct, and that the man beside her was indeed in 2B. Joanne, now feeling more unsettled than ever, let out a forced laugh. "Oh, I see," she said, trying to brush it off. But her tone was brittle. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about something deeper. Something she couldn't quite put into words. Joanne's discomfort deepened as she sat there, trying to maintain her composure while everything inside her felt like it was unraveling. The man beside her, still oblivious to her presence, continued typing away on his laptop, completely absorbed in his work. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the situation than just a simple seating issue. She had tried to make a polite inquiry, asking if he was sure he was in the right seat, but his dismissive response only fueled her frustration. Joanne wasn't the type of person to be ignored. She was used to being acknowledged, respected, and even admired. In the business world, people responded to her with politeness, professionalism, and sometimes even admiration, but this man didn't give her the courtesy of even a glance. There was no polite exchange, no attempt at small talk. It was as if she didn't exist in his world. She shifted uneasily in her seat, adjusting her position, crossing and uncrossing her legs in an attempt to distract herself from the growing tension inside her. She noticed everything around her, the businessman across the aisle sipping his drink, the couple whispering softly, the woman adjusting her blanket a few rows ahead. Everything seemed perfectly normal, except for the man beside her, who sat perfectly still, focused on his screen. Joanne tried to reason with herself, telling herself it was just a strange moment, nothing more, but deep down, she knew it was something deeper. It wasn't the rudeness that bothered her, it was the indifference. The absence of acknowledgement made her feel invisible, like she didn't matter. She had never felt that way before. People always noticed her, whether it was in the workplace, at social events, or even in passing. She was someone who commanded attention, whether she wanted it or not. But this man, this stranger, didn't seem to care at all, and that stung in a way that she couldn't explain. She turned her gaze back to the front of the cabin, trying to focus on something else. But her mind kept wandering back to him. His stillness was unnerving. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't fidgeting, and he wasn't pretending not to notice her. He was completely absorbed in whatever task he was doing on his laptop. And that only made Joanne feel more insignificant. She glanced at him again, her eyes lingering for just a moment longer, hoping to catch some sign of recognition, some flicker of awareness that she was there. But there was nothing, not a glance, not a twitch, not a hint that he had any idea that she was even sharing the same space. Joanne exhaled quietly through her nose, trying to remain calm. She had always prided herself on her ability to control her emotions and her responses. But this situation was challenging her composure in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't used to feeling so small, so insignificant. She wasn't used to being ignored. Slowly, she reached for the armrest, her fingers brushing against his elbow just barely. It was a small thing, but it was enough for her to register that he hadn't flinched, hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her presence in any way. She pulled her arm back slightly, just enough to reclaim her space. But there was no apology from him, no acknowledgement, not even a glance. She felt her frustration mounting. She wasn't sure what to do next. But something inside her was demanding that she take control of the situation. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, and this situation was starting to make her feel just that. It wasn't just the man's lack of response that was bothering her. It was the feeling that she didn't matter to him, that she was invisible in his eyes. She had worked hard to build a career and a life where she was seen, where she was valued. But here, on this plane, she was nothing more than a shadow in his world. Her mind raced as she searched for a solution, some way to regain her sense of control. She reached into her handbag, adjusting the strap nervously as she looked around the cabin once more. Everything seemed normal, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Joanne turned toward the front of the cabin, trying to steady her breath and her racing thoughts. But her gaze kept returning to the man beside her. He was still typing, still silent, still unfazed by her presence. His indifference was like a weight pressing down on her, making her feel smaller and more insignificant with each passing second. She couldn't understand it, she couldn't accept it, and finally, She couldn't sit there any longer. Feeling this way, her patience snapped, and she pressed the call button. It wasn't something she did lightly, but at that moment, it felt like the only way to regain some semblance of control. The flight attendant, Rachel, appeared quickly, her calm demeanor unchanged. Joanne leaned in slightly, trying to sound as polite as possible, though the frustration was clear in her voice. "I think there may have been a mistake," she said, trying to mask the tension she felt. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I don't recall anyone sitting in that seat." Rachel looked over at the man beside her, then back at Joanne, her expression polite but giving nothing away. After a moment of checking the seating chart on her tablet, Rachel confirmed that there was no mistake. Joanne was in seat 2A, and the man next to her, Mr. Ross, was in 2B, exactly as the seating manifest indicated. Joanne let out a forced laugh, trying to brush off the situation. "Oh, I see," she replied, her voice betraying her frustration. "These systems change so often. It's hard to keep up." Rachel gave a polite smile and nodded, assuring her that everything was in order and that if she needed anything else, she should let her know. But as Rachel walked away, Joanne sat still, the smile fading from her lips. Inside, her frustration was boiling. She couldn't understand it, she couldn't let it go. The man beside her hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her in any way. He was completely indifferent, and that was what hurt the most. Joanne's mind was racing as she sat in her seat, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man beside her remained completely still, absorbed in his work, showing no interest in her presence. He hadn't reacted to her question earlier, hadn't flinched when their elbows brushed, and hadn't even acknowledged her existence. It was unsettling in a way she couldn't explain, and the more she tried to understand it, the more frustrated she became. She wasn't used to being ignored. She was someone who commanded attention, someone who was used to being acknowledged, even when she didn't expect it. But this man was different. He was impervious to her presence. She glanced at him again, hoping to see some sign of awareness, but he remained focused on his laptop, his fingers moving steadily across the keys. His lack of response, his calmness, felt almost deliberate. She wasn't sure if it was rudeness or just complete indifference, but it gnawed at her. The situation was making her feel small, invisible. She had built a life where she was seen, where people respected her, where her voice mattered. But now, in the confines of this first-class cabin, she felt insignificant. Joanne shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to reclaim some sense of control. She crossed her legs, uncrossed them, tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, and looked around the cabin. Everything seemed normal. Other passengers were quietly sipping their drinks, reading newspapers, or simply looking out the windows. Yet, no one else seemed to be experiencing the same discomfort that she was. It was only her and the man beside her. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it wasn't a big deal, but the feeling of being disregarded refused to leave. There was something unsettling about how he didn't respond to her. He wasn't rude, but his complete lack of acknowledgement made her feel like she didn't exist to him. In the past, people always responded to her, whether it was a smile, a polite answer, or just some form of recognition. But this man had none of that. She turned back to the front of the cabin, trying to steady her breathing and calm her thoughts. But her gaze kept drifting back to him. She couldn't help it. There was something about his calmness that seemed so unbothered. It was like he wasn't aware of the social dynamics around him. Or maybe he just didn't care. His demeanor was so solid, so untouchable. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply existed in his space with complete confidence. And that confidence was making her feel more and more out of place. Joanne was used to being seen, respected, acknowledged, but here she was, sitting beside someone who didn't even seem to care. It was a harsh reminder of how powerless she felt in this moment. The flight attendant, Rachel, was moving up and down the aisle, attending to passengers, yet Joanne couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being heard, that her discomfort didn't matter to anyone. She felt completely alone, caught in a situation she didn't know how to navigate. The thought crossed her mind that maybe it wasn't just the man beside her. It was her own sense of entitlement. Her belief that people should notice her, should engage with her. Maybe it was that expectation that had caused this entire internal struggle. Still, it didn't make the situation any easier to bear. Her frustration was building, and she felt the need to take action, to regain control in some way. Finally, Joanne leaned forward and pressed the call button, breaking the silence between them. It was a small gesture, but it gave her a sense of power, a sense of control over the situation, even if it was just a fleeting moment. The soft chime rang overhead, and Rachel appeared moments later, her calm demeanor unchanged. Joanne leaned in slightly, her voice lower than before, trying to sound as reasonable as possible, though there was a hint of strain in her words. "I think there may have been a mistake," she said, attempting to mask her frustration. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I don't remember anyone sitting in that seat." Rachel glanced at the man beside her, then back at Joanne. After checking her tablet, Rachel confirmed that everything was in order, that Joanne was in seat 2A and the man was indeed in 2B. Joanne's attempt to brush off the situation failed, and she let out a small, forced laugh. "Oh, I see," she said, her tone brittle. "These systems change so often. It's hard to keep up sometimes." Rachel offered a polite smile, assuring her that everything was fine, and if she needed anything else, she should let her know. But as Rachel walked away, Joanne's sense of unease only intensified. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the lack of acknowledgement from the man beside her was a sign of something more profound. Something beyond mere rudeness. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about being seen, about being recognized. The more she tried to focus on the rest of the flight, the more her thoughts returned to him. His composure, his indifference. It was as though he was telling her, without words, that he didn't need to play by the same rules. He didn't need to acknowledge her, didn't need to give her the courtesy of a smile or a nod. And somehow, that was what bothered her the most. She was invisible to him. And that, more than anything, was what she couldn't accept. The flight continued, but the tension inside Joanne only intensified as the minutes passed. Every second spent beside the man, Julian Ross, felt like an eternity. His indifference had already shaken her sense of control. But now, the stillness between them was unbearable. She tried to regain her composure, shifting in her seat, adjusting her handbag, trying to focus on anything other than the fact that this man beside her was a wall of silence. She looked out the window, hoping the passing clouds could offer some escape from the feeling of being trapped in this uncomfortable situation. But her mind kept racing back to him, to the fact that he hadn't even so much as acknowledged her presence. It was as if she didn't exist in his world. Her internal conflict grew more complex by the second. Joanne had always prided herself on being noticed, respected, and heard. In her world, silence was rare. People responded to her, and when they didn't, there was usually a reason. But with Julian, there was no response, no explanation, nothing. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the fact that he ignored her, or the fact that he was so comfortable doing so. Her irritation built until she could no longer sit still. She had tried to dismiss it, to let it go, but it was impossible. She wasn't the type of person who let things slide, especially not when her dignity was at stake. Joanne had always had a sense of entitlement, one that came from years of experience, leadership, and a position in life that demanded respect. But this man wasn't playing by those rules. And that was exactly what was bothering her. She had reached a breaking point. With a small but deliberate movement, she pressed the call button. The soft chime rang overhead. And moments later, Rachel, the flight attendant, approached. Joanne leaned in, trying to sound as polite as possible, though her tone betrayed her growing frustration. "I think there may have been a mistake," she said, attempting to sound reasonable. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I don't recall anyone ever sitting in that seat." Rachel glanced at Julian, who was still engrossed in his laptop, and then back at Joanne. There was no sign of recognition, no shift in the air, just the calm professionalism that Rachel always exuded. After a quick check on her tablet, Rachel confirmed that everything was in order. That Joanne was indeed in 2A and Julian in 2B. Joanne tried to cover her discomfort with a forced laugh. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice becoming brittle. "These systems change so often. It's hard to keep up sometimes." Rachel smiled politely and assured her that everything was fine, offering her assistance if needed. But as Rachel walked away, Joanne felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about something deeper. Something she couldn't ignore. The man beside her had acted like she didn't even matter. It wasn't rudeness, it was indifference. And that was what unsettled her the most. Joanne sat still for a moment, the uncomfortable silence now weighing heavily on her. She had spent years building a life in which she was seen and heard, where her presence mattered, and now she was faced with someone who didn't even acknowledge her existence. It felt like a slap in the face, and it gnawed at her. She wasn't sure why this man's behavior bothered her so much, but it did. It was like he had claimed his space and, by doing so, made it clear that she didn't belong in it. She fidgeted in her seat again, her thoughts swirling. It wasn't just about the flight, or the seat, or the man next to her. It was about something deeper. Her sense of self was being questioned. She had always been a leader, a figure who commanded respect. But here, beside this man, she felt invisible. Her presence didn't matter to him, and that was something she had never experienced before. Julian sat there, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her, his focus unwavering. He hadn't flinched when she had questioned him earlier, hadn't reacted when their elbows brushed. It was as if he knew something she didn't, something that gave him the confidence to exist in his space without needing anyone else's validation. His quiet strength was unnerving. Joanne was used to being the one in control, used to being the one others turned to for answers. But now, she felt like she was powerless. It wasn't just that Julian didn't acknowledge her, it was that his indifference made her question everything she had once known about herself. She had always been seen, always been acknowledged, but in this moment, she felt as if she were fading into the background, a mere blur in someone else's world. The realization hit her hard. She couldn't change the way he treated her, couldn't make him notice her, and that was the hardest pill to swallow. Joanne's thoughts swirled with confusion and frustration. She wanted to say something, to break the silence, to make him understand how uncomfortable his behavior was making her feel. But deep down, she knew that it wouldn't change anything. She wasn't sure if he was unaware of the discomfort he was causing, or if he simply didn't care. Either way, it didn't matter. He wasn't going to respond. And that was the most difficult part. Joanne sat back in her seat, her hands resting on her lap, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about the realization that sometimes, people just don't care. And in that silence, Joanne understood something that she wasn't ready to accept. Not everyone has to play by the same rules. Not everyone will acknowledge her, and not everyone will treat her the way she expected. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling truth of all. Joanne's frustration had now reached a breaking point. She had been trying to hold it together, trying to dismiss the growing discomfort, but it was impossible to ignore. The silence between her and Julian, the man beside her, felt suffocating. His complete disregard for her presence was unsettling in a way she couldn't fully explain. She had tried everything: politeness, direct communication, even a small, deliberate attempt to reclaim her space, but none of it had worked. He remained completely absorbed in his work, utterly indifferent to her. This was not the kind of behavior Joanne was used to. She was a person who demanded respect, who was accustomed to being seen and acknowledged wherever she went. But here, beside this man, she felt invisible, as if she didn't matter. Joanne wasn't used to being ignored, and the longer it went on, the more it gnawed at her. Every time she glanced at him, he was still typing, focused, unaware, or perhaps, uncaring. She couldn't figure out which one bothered her more. It wasn't about the rudeness, it was about the complete lack of recognition. It was as if he had created a bubble around himself that she couldn't penetrate. His calmness, his quiet confidence, only amplified her own feelings of inadequacy. In her world, Silence was something to be broken, not something to be embraced so completely. People interacted, engaged, acknowledged one another, but this man didn't seem to follow the same rules. She shifted in her seat again, trying to reorient herself, but the tension in her chest refused to ease. Joanne was used to being the one who was noticed, the one who commanded attention without asking for it. She had spent her career building relationships, fostering respect, and making sure people knew who she was. But here, on this plane, she was simply another face, a nameless presence beside a man who clearly didn't care about her existence. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The more she tried to rationalize the situation, the more confused she became. She wasn't angry, at least not in the traditional sense. She was unsettled, unsure of how to process what was happening. Julian wasn't being outright rude. He wasn't saying anything at all. And that, in itself, was what hurt the most. Joanne's discomfort grew as the flight continued. Every second spent beside him felt like a reminder of her own diminishing sense of control. She wasn't sure how to handle this feeling, but one thing was clear: she couldn't let it go. She had always been the one in charge, the one who knew how to navigate through uncomfortable situations. But now, she was powerless. Her thoughts began to spiral, and she felt a desperate need to regain control, to do something that would restore the balance. Finally, she made a decision. She leaned forward slightly and pressed the call button above her. The soft chime rang through the cabin, and moments later, Rachel, the flight attendant, appeared at her side. Joanne forced a smile, trying to mask her growing frustration. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice tight, though she tried to keep it light. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I just don't recall anyone sitting in that seat." Rachel glanced at Julian, still absorbed in his work, and then back at Joanne. She tapped a few keys on her tablet, checking the manifest, her face unreadable. After a moment, she confirmed what Joanne had already heard. There was no mistake. Joanne was in 2A, and Julian was indeed in 2B. Joanne's smile faded, replaced by a forced laugh. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice growing even more brittle. "These systems change so often. It's hard to keep up, isn't it?" Rachel offered a polite, neutral smile but said nothing more. She reassured Joanne that if she needed anything else, she could let her know. But as the flight attendant moved away, Joanne's unease only deepened. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about something deeper. The indifference from Julian was unsettling in a way that went beyond mere rudeness. It was a complete lack of recognition, a refusal to acknowledge another person in the shared space. Joanne was used to being seen, being acknowledged, and this lack of recognition felt like a blow to her sense of self. The longer she sat there, the more it gnawed at her. She couldn't understand why it bothered her so much. It wasn't like the man had done anything offensive. He had simply ignored her, not even offering the smallest sign that she mattered. But that's what made it so difficult. She wasn't accustomed to being invisible. She had built her life on being someone who was noticed, someone who commanded attention. But here, on this plane, beside this man, she felt like an afterthought. Joanne shifted once more in her seat, her movements now stiff and forced. She tried to look out the window again, hoping the view would bring some comfort. But her mind kept drifting back to him. Julian was still typing, still completely unaware of her presence. His stillness wasn't casual. It was deliberate, unyielding, and it was slowly driving her to the edge. Joanne wasn't sure how long she could endure this silent tension. Every second beside him felt like a reminder of how powerless she was in this moment. She couldn't control him, she couldn't make him acknowledge her, and she couldn't make the discomfort go away. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about the realization that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't make people see you.